So today we will explore Turgenev's magnum opus, possibly one of his most famous books, apart from Fathers and Sons, the book Spring Torrents. Now, this is a very interesting novel because there has been some discussion amongst literary critics that this could possibly be based off of Turgenev's own experiences. It's not something that can be entirely confirmed, but it does seem that looking at his biography, the back of the edition of the book I have has quite a good critical essay that includes some interesting thoughts on how the protagonist of this book, Sanin, is a way of Turgenev expressing his own experiences. So, for me, it seems as though Turgenev, to an extent, seems to be living somewhat vicariously through this character, Dmitry Sanin. And you see an element of personal experience, so it's not as vicarious as such. You know, Turgenev may have had his own exploits and his own history that he may be presenting here through a fictional story. One of the things that I noticed is, as you're reading the book, you get a sense that a lot of the experiences seem quite personal. A lot of the descriptions of the process of maybe falling in love seem to be very idiosyncratic to an individual experience. And to me, that seems as if maybe Turgenev is recounting a historical event and something that's happened to him. And so the details of the emotional aspects of falling in love, of the way in which people relate to each other, seem to be quite realistic. Maybe that's an expression of his skill as a writer, but possibly it's an expression of him recounting something that he's gone through. So it's hard to say the extent to which this is true. It is conjecture, but it's an interesting way to approach the book, and it makes it, in my experience at least, a more of an enjoyable read as you see him try and distance himself from his protagonist. Turgenev is quite critical of his protagonist. A lot of the language he uses is very, you could say, dismissive of Sanin's behavior, and the way that Sanin is presented as a character who's very fickle, a man who is very fickle, very easily influenced by others. It does feel like a cathartic novel. You feel every emotion. There are a lot of descriptions. It's very descriptive, both in the sense of the descriptions of nature, which are very beautiful, and create this amazing background and this setting for the story to take place. This sense of a world being built, the world building in and of itself is very good, and makes a very enjoyable read. And a lot of the descriptions of Sanin meeting this girl called Gemma, and the experience of falling in love with this girl being like a veil being lifted between him and the face of true happiness for all eternity. It seems quite dramatic. He's only just met this girl. A couple of days into getting to know this girl, he's having these revelations. Maybe that's a reflection of the time, but actually it seems like things are progressing quite quickly, and maybe Sanin's getting ahead of himself to an extent. To us, it seems as though maybe this love, to the extent that it can be called that, is doomed to failure because of how quickly things progress and how fast things go from 0 to 100 in a sense. There are echoes of maybe things aren't quite going to go to plan. Sanin falls head over heels for this girl, and it seems that that's doomed to failure because of how quickly, and not just how quickly, but how intensely, maybe this is a fire that burns really bright, for a short period of time. And it's almost convenient how so many events line up in an almost sort of mythical way for him to meet this girl, and for things to be lined up for them to be together. So Turgenev is a hopeless romantic in the context of this novel, anyways. The way he's describing things and the way the story progresses is very idealistic, and it's a nice way for the reader, anyways, to kind of lose themselves in the world of this novel. And so, from that point of view, it can be quite an enjoyable read. But unfortunately, reality does strike eventually. And there's good use of nature. So kind of the wind seems to blow at the right time, allowing these star-crossed lovers to unite. So and whenever they're together, it kind of seems like nature itself is conspiring to bring them closer together. And that backdrop of spring, that backdrop of rebirth and a new life is used to great effect by Turgenev. And for myself, maybe I am quite cynical in that sense. The confessions of love were very effusive. It sort of felt like Sanin is trying to convince himself as to how valid his claims of love are. And it does feel like, in a sense, sort of like a theatrical performance almost. There is a lot of references to the theatre early on, and a lot of the bonding that happens between Gemma, Sanin, and Gemma's family is kind of over their shared interest in opera and theatre, and I think that's intentional. I think it's hinting at something. It all feels like a piece of performative theatre almost, that he's acting out with Gemma and her family, and even the dog, sort of right on cue, behaves in a way or kind of plays its part. That's something that when you read certain sections, you get a sense that it's difficult to feel that it's sincere. And the references to opera and theatre alongside that is quite a nice touch, and it's something that definitely sparked my interest early on to try and think that there's a kind of an impending twist later on. And there's this question that is raised, is that this might not be a sincere relationship being formed, but it's an escapism of sorts. The family's mundane everyday life. This stranger has entered into that life and is bringing them a bit of drama, into their lives, and they're playing along with that for the sake of entertainment, maybe for the sake of change, or maybe they sincerely believe his claims and they are genuinely invested in hoping that things go well for Gemma and Sanin. But it almost feels like how happy they are to see this stranger, who they know not much about, on their second and third visit. It seems like they're quite glad to get some reprieve from a life that they feel is quite tedious. And so unfortunately, eventually Sanin goes out. He finds some barriers to the progression of his relationship. He wants to marry Gemma, but he doesn't have the funds to do so. And so he promises to go to a separate state. He promises to go and find one of his close friends to see if he can sell his property. And so he's willing to put it all on the line, to sell his property so that he can give the appropriate dowry and be able to convince Gemma's mother to give him her daughter's hand in marriage. But it seems that during this trip, Sanin is confronted by his lack of self-control. He is confronted by the reality of Maria Nikolaevna, who is the wife of his friend, and they seem to have something of an open relationship. And what ends up happening is, of course, Sanin is seduced by this lady, and it happens in a sense quite easily. It doesn't take much, so much to say, and by that point, as the reader, you lose all confidence and trust in Sanin, because he's proven himself to be quite untrustworthy, and all of his previous assertions of true love very quickly assertions that you're already quite suspicious of because they're so over the top. Quite quickly, those suspicions are proven true, and he just crumbles in the hands of Maria Nikolaevna, almost like a withered petal. And those feelings of burning passion for Gemma are gone, really. Um, of course, he still has feelings for her, but they're clearly not strong enough for him to control his own carnal desires. And so it's an interesting tragedy in that initially you see so many barriers to this idyllic life that Sanin is imagining, and you never really expect that barrier to be his own lack of self-control and his own inability to discipline himself and to keep his sexual desires under control. In a sense, even he couldn't have predicted that. Maybe the reader could have, because how quickly he fell for Gemma is maybe a bit of a hint that this is a man who's quite fickle, as mentioned earlier. It's someone that doesn't have a very strong resolve of his own and is very easily swayed and very easily talked into things, swayed by beauty, because he missed his original plan was to actually journey to Berlin. And he was so swept up with Gemma and the family that, the fact that he wasn't able to follow through on his plans that early in the novel is reflected later on as well. This is not a trustworthy individual, and it's not someone that's going to be able to follow through on things. And that's how Turgenev presents this character, as someone who lacks strong constitution, someone who is almost a victim to his desires instead of being in control of them. He's a victim to Maria Nikolaevna. That's how it's presented. That's the language that's used, is that he's this innocent young, this innocent little boy who has been caught up with the wrong crowd, and almost in a sense of like a pathetic character. And so Turgenev is not very complimentary to his protagonist in the way that he's presented. Maybe he's doing some soul searching there about his own background and things that he may have been involved in the past. It's hard to say. In a sense, you feel that maybe this was always bound to happen, because of the aforementioned lack of direction that he had. And firstly for Gemma, and now for his captor, in a sense, he always lacked the strength to follow through, and he let other people's whims dictate his actions. He never had his own direct path through life. And so Sanin is obviously rightly quite disgusted with himself. He's quite dejected, and he's unable to even face his beloved to go and tell her what's happened, after this, very vile betrayal. And so he runs away. He does not face up to, he fails to face the music. He does what he always does, and he backs away from confronting the consequences of his actions. And in a sense, he thinks himself as being quite strong, quite passionate, but even he's fallen victim to his most base of desires. And so Turgenev is posing a question to the power of idealistic romantic love in the face of real life, in the face of desires that might sway you. How strong is your commitment to pursuing love or true love? Are you actually able to follow that through? And so unfortunately our protagonist loses himself in the moment, and that raises a question about, was his love worthwhile? Did it mean anything? Or was it just something that was weak? And I think that it raises a question regarding Turgenev's own relationship with carnal desire. And throughout the book, he expresses this fear, potentially, of the opposite sex, especially in his descriptions of Maria Nikolaevna. You could make an argument that these descriptions and her as a character is quite misogynistic. I mean, she is painted as this seductress, this evil woman that has trapped our poor little boy protagonist, which is kind of falling into a lot of the tropes of the time, painting women in that sort of light as being using their sexual power to kind of get what they want out of a situation. And it's quite hard to separate that from the book. It seems to be quite heavily painted with that approach. And so, all in all, as a novel, it is quite a nice, story, to the extent that it's quite easy to read. It's quite easy to follow. There's a clear progression. There's a very clear sort of climax to the story, and you might not necessarily see the twist in the novel itself. But there is a lot of underlying themes and underlying questions that are raised throughout, especially regarding to what extent are these claims made initially by the protagonist. When you reflect back on them after what's happened, you feel as though this isn't someone that has the strength or the constitution to actually follow through with them. And again, it's a good reflection on a lot of the themes explored at the time. And it's a really interesting twist on the traditional sort of tragedy, as it were, the traditional tragic romance. It's kind of showing how, by his own hands, Sanin has destroyed the thing that was most beloved to him and most important to him. And in some sense, you feel that he never really learns his lesson. By the end of the book, as he's reflecting on these events, he goes on to make a decision that's quite interesting. He's failed to really learn and to move on from this, and so that is best left unsaid. And I'll leave it up to the reader to decide how they feel about the conclusion of the novel.